Welcome to the Whistleblower Newsroom. I'm Christina Borgeson. Turns out the biggest and arguably the best questions submitted to the 9/11 Commission for answers came from a group of victim family members calling themselves the Family Steering Committee for the 9/11 Independent Commission. To their dismay and disappointment, the 9/11 Commission ignored most of the Family Steering Committee's questions and eventually ended the investigation with the bizarre, some say duplicitous conclusion that, quote, a failure of imagination, unquote, caused 9/11. In his recent book, titled Unanswered Questions, What the September 11th Families Asked and the 9/11 Commission Ignored, author Ray McGinnis pays powerful tribute to those families by documenting their questions, writing about the Family Steering Committee's efforts to get answers from the 9/11 Commission, and digging out many answers for the families himself. I recently interviewed McGinnis about the book and his findings. The thing about this book that is so amazing is that what I think you did was you took all their questions and then in the it's like their questions framed all the information that you then went and gathered that was pertinent to those questions to answer them in a way where if it seems like over and over they keep talking about the failures before 9/11, but the way that your research has been done, you could replace the word failure with crimes or malfeasance,
Yeah.
and it would be more accurate. So
Yes, I agree.
so you start with the Family Steering Committee, okay, with the Family Steering Committee for the 9/11 Independent Commission, Kristen Breitweiser, Patty Casaza, Mindy Kleinberg, and Lori Van Auken. And they ask all these questions. And so could you start just by detailing the setup of the 9/11 Commission and all the aspects of it that were rigged?
Okay, well, it's such an interesting group, the Family Steering Committee. And I would say one of the first surprises as I began to do my research is that it could have been a surprise that they would have had questions at all, or that they would have not stood shoulder to shoulder with the 9/11 Commission when the report came out and said, good job, thank you very much. You have, of the dozen people on the Family Steering Committee, of those that I know of, 5 of them who spoke to the press and said how they voted in the year 2000, 3 out of 5 voted for the Bush-Cheney ticket.
Wow.
So we don't have like 12 people who were fired up radical Democrats ready to go, push and shove with the Bush administration. Patty Casaza voted for the Bush-Cheney ticket, and it was only the stonewalling. That's the first thing. They want to have an investigation just to make the nation safe, and so then there's suddenly 14 months of stonewalling. President Bush and Vice President Cheney say, "Well, we don't have any money. We're busy with the war on terror. It will be a distraction. It'll only encourage the terrorists if we have an investigation." And so that's
yeah. What would the rationale, the encouragement be there for the terror? I mean, even their claims are so ridiculous. So, why would it encourage the terrorists to engage in more terrorism by doing an investigation and making them accountable for what they did?
Purportedly, an investigation would show where the holes are in the defense system and make the nation more ready to fend off another attack. But that didn't seem to be something that they wanted to be curious about. And then one of the next encounters is the naming. Finally, in November of 2001 or 2002, President Bush says, "Okay, we'll have an investigation. Let's name Dr. Henry Kissinger to head this up." And then the Families Steering Committee, most of them meet with Dr. Kissinger in his offices in the nice Tony apartments on Park Avenue or Madison Avenue. And Lori Van Auken asked the question, because they want to make sure there's no conflict of interest, Dr. Kissinger, do you have any clients by the name of bin Laden? And at that point, he spills the coffee all over the table, falls halfway off the couch, and blames it on a fake eye. And then he resigns the next day for whatever reason.
Now, okay, so already we have Bush for a year has tried to avoid having a commission or having any investigation. So already there's something fishy here. You don't want to know who exactly, because you want to blame it on bin Laden right away. You don't want to know who all was involved. Then what do? You appoint Kissinger. Why would you appoint Kissinger?
A long history of secrecy, and New York Times, Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, all saying this is a guy who's got a long track record for penchant for secrecy and cover up. So not a good signal to the families about really seriously wanting to investigate.
So you appoint him, and they obviously uncover the fact that Kissinger is not the guy. So then what happens?
So then they appoint Tom Keene, who I think some of the families only much later learn happens to be on the board of at least one of the companies that's part of the consortium that's looking eagerly at having a pipeline go across Afghanistan. I don't remember if I got that in the book, but that was, one of the, so there he is. And then there's more problematically Lee Hamilton, longtime Democrat from Indiana. And many people who are not familiar with him, as many of the families wouldn't have been, would think, okay, great, he's a Democrat. He's going to be on our side, perhaps. And then they find out that Lee Hamilton was involved in the Iran-Contra scandal commission. Oliver North told him that he hadn't lied, and Lee Hamilton said he couldn't believe that Oliver North would lie to his face. He said he never liked to go for the jugular. He was a longtime friend of both Vice President Cheney and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. Maybe he would be partial to not wanting to expose anything that might put his two long-term friends in the wrong light. So, and then they find out when they start to meet with Hamilton and Keene that Lee Hamilton would not like to have any swearing of oaths, doesn't want to have any subpoenas, doesn't want to have any public hearings. And so, Kristen Breitweiser says she took an instant disliking, it's just really problematic in terms of what do you want to do in terms of getting to the bottom of something when you don't want to investigate anything.
Yeah. So, okay. So already you have the fix in with these two guys, but then they bring on Philip Zelikow.
Yeah.
So talk about, as executive director of the commission, who's in charge of actually making everything, implementing what the commission is going to do. And also, I think it's important to talk about how they described their mission. So in that way, they were limiting their mandate so that it really wasn't a real investigation.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. Like on the one hand, you have Commissioner, I think Tim Romer and Jim Thompson that echoed the families about wanting to sort of leave no stone unturned in some opening statements on the first public hearing in late March of 2003. And then you have Philip Zelikow, who's also co-authored a book with Condoleezza Rice, who co-wrote a book about President Kennedy's thoughts about Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the way he torques things and how he reports things. The Atlantic Monthly and some other people who looked at it said, look, Zelikow is making the statements of the president say the opposite of what they in fact said if you go to the original sources. So here you've got someone who is turning things 180 degrees away from what they actually mean and misstating and misquoting, And then he's also involved in helping to write up, or principally write up, the whole policy regarding preemptive war and going into Iraq. So,
well, to me, he was the primary fixer on the commission. And so let's talk about the things that he did to fix things so that the report would come out with essentially a ridiculous conclusion, like it was all a failure of imagination.
Yeah. So there are people who are, there's Zellicoe, and then senior counsel Ernst May are, running the show, Zellicoe in principal. And you've got 78 other 9/11 Commission staff, and some of them are real crackerjacks. Dana Lessman and Mike Jacobson had been part of the 9/11, the joint 9/11 inquiry with the Senate and Congress, and they wanted to look at different information, subpoena information from the Department of Defense and CIA and FBI. And Zellicoe kept saying, "Oh no, we can't do that because we don't want to make anyone mad or upset with us." And when Dana Lessman she already had clearance with the CIA, she went off and got some files that she wanted to get to do a good job. And then he fired her as a sign that nobody else is supposed to go and do any kind of brown nosing or going into it in a good way.
Anybody gathering inconvenient information is not going to be well received. And I mean, the fact that he fired her and what she was going after, I believe, was information on Saudi involvement in 9/11, right?
Yeah.
And boy, throughout this whole thing, the Saudis are protected 1,000% by everybody.
It's just incredible. And then, of course, at the top of the heap, Zellicoe and Ernst May co-author, they create an outline for the 9/11 Commission report, chapter headings and subheadings in the month of March 2003, before the first hearing happens. The co-chairs, Tom Keene and Lee Hamilton, see it, and they all agree, the four of them, that they should keep this secret. So nobody else in the 9/11 Commission commissioners, none of the Family Steering Committee members, none of the other 9/11 Commission staff are aware of this outline until it comes out in the spring of 2004, that there's an outline that's fairly prescriptive around what they think that they're going to find. But so often what you want to do when you do an investigation is you just start to investigate, and you have witnesses that come forward and they might give you some new information. Then you have to go in some whole new directions, which means you have to write some whole new chapters with whole new chapter headings. But instead they corralled it in such a way that they ended up being able to say it was a failure of imagination, because that was their assumption.
I don't know of any investigation of something as big as 9/11 where people died and there was all this death and destruction, where it would be acceptable for an investigation to end with just, oh, well, it was a failure of imagination. I mean, that makes no sense to me. And the interesting thing about Zellicoe too was he seemed to have been in constant contact with Condoleezza Rice, right?
Yes.
And somebody else in the White House.
Karl Rove, the senior White House counsel.
Yeah. He was, so I mean, already that fix was in. And nobody at the time, when the report came out, nobody really reported that right off the bat. Nobody talked about how the whole thing, about all the riggery that went on. I mean, first of all, let's start with the fact that Bush, when he set up the commission, gave them a ridiculous budget. You compared it to the Monica Lewinsky budget, which was $50 million. This one, they gave only $3 million. And these are classic tactics, containment exercise tactics. Okay. You give them a small budget. Okay. You put fixers in the top positions. Okay. So that they can filter everything and make sure nobody gets out of line. Like he, fired his own assistant for bringing in that information about the Saudis. Okay. And then you cherry pick your witnesses.
Yes, you cherry pick your witnesses, and you also make sure. I mean, there's two different aspects to how this is developing. On the one hand, you have 12 public hearings with 18 days of public hearings, and the families are seeing along with anyone else who's going to these public hearings, the witnesses that are brought forth. And then you have 8 teams of commission staff interviewing most of the witnesses in private, behind closed doors. But nonetheless, you still have witnesses coming forth, and you have what are called government minders, people who are higher up in their department, CIA, FBI, FAA, DOD, and there they are, sitting right beside them, the witness, or standing behind them, perhaps with their hand on the shoulder. And if the witness starts to say something in response to a question the commissioner asks, that minder might interrupt and answer the question themselves, and the witness is just sitting there knowing that they shouldn't say anything more, or they're censoring themselves because they're thinking, how is this going to go back in my department if I say what I know?
The minder thing was really very disturbing to me. I don't understand. Could not the commission have said, you minders, we didn't invite you to come and testify. This guy is testifying. Let him testify on his own. I mean, was that not an option for them to demand that?
It should have been an option to demand that. And there were some public statements by Tom Keene and Lee Hamilton that this was a concern of the commissioners. However, as with many things throughout, they didn't want to play, quote, hardball with the White House, and so, or with any of the other agencies. And so it's all part of a long trajectory of, just like they don't want to subpoena very often, well, hardly at all throughout the length of the commission did they want to subpoena, because they didn't want anyone to be upset with them. They didn't want to make the White House, put on their bad books. And so it's softball questions.
That is not the role of an investigation, to worry about whether you're going to hurt somebody's feelings or make them angry. I mean, your first, and that's again, I want to go back to how they really put a limit on what their investigative mandate was. I mean, I think it was it Keene who said, we're not here to ascribe blame. We want to know what the failures were, because what we're really mandated to do is figure out how to avoid this happening again. And I just thought to myself, what kind of an investigation is that? When you do an investigation, you're trying to figure out who did it, so you can hold them accountable. And that's how it doesn't happen again. You hold them accountable, and then it doesn't happen again because they're in jail forever or whatever. But to say, oh, we just want to know what we can do so it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, it's confounding to a whole range of families, because the families that are coming forward, that are spearheading this investigation, that are the family steering committee members and others that are part of affiliate groups that the families steering committee members represent, like the families of September 11th, the FOS 11, which is a very establishment group. You've got Robin Weiner, who is on the Family Steering Committee, who's with this FOS 11. She's the president of the Institute for Recycling and Scrap Industries. You've got Carrie Lemack, whose mother, Judy LaRock, died in an airplane, and she later on becomes the president of the Camilla group, which is a national security business. And so these are, Robin Weiner had been involved as a lawyer with legal and political matters in Congress. So you've got some very establishment people here, but nonetheless, Stephen Push, who was with the FOS 11, says, he says, I don't believe in conspiracy theories, he says on the 31st of March, 2003, but there were problems. People fell down on the job. We want to know who fell down on the job. And you've got this pushback from Lee Hamilton and Tom Keene saying, oh no, we don't want to blame anybody. And so it's crazy. But what they do want to do is blame someone, which is principally Osama bin Laden. And they're saying, we don't need to really, we already know who we need to write about.
We're not presenting the proof because that's classified, right? Isn't that when they were saying, hey, provide, because the Taliban themselves said, hey, we'll deliver him to an international court. Just send us the proof. Just send us what proof you have that he did it.
It's a very confusing story about how this goes. And I think a lot of people missed quite a few of the key headlines that unfolded from September into into the new year of 2002. Because at first, bin Laden says in a press release around the 16th of September, I didn't do it. And then Colin Powell, Secretary of State, goes before a Sunday morning news show and says, well, we're going to have a white paper and we'll show the world the proof. And then Ari Fleischer in the White House press room the next day tells the press, I think Colin Powell is mistaken. He didn't say anything about, quote, white paper, even though he did roll the tape. And so people in the press gallery said, so you're just asking us to trust us, which is what they were doing. And then there's questions, Dick Cheney says, yes, bin Laden did it. And then the Taliban says, as you mentioned, that, well, we'll hand over bin Laden to an international court, The Hague or something, if you have some evidence of some sort. And Bush just says, we don't need evidence. We know he's guilty. And later on in the winter, there's a lucky break for the seems the Pentagon. The U.S. forces are in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, and somebody finds probably a house in a war zone that I don't know how badly damaged the house is or how much rubble and stuff is falling around in the kitchen and the grenades going off in the living room. But anyway, a miracle of miracles, a wonderful videotape that says bin Laden confession tape just happens to be sitting there, perhaps on a coffee table, and they take it back to America, and the Pentagon releases it on the 13th of December, and a much stockier bin Laden with a much bigger face, maybe even a bigger skull, who wears lots of jewelry, starts saying, yes, it was me. But even The Guardian in the UK and other mainstream papers say that it seems too convenient that this would be the case.
It's obvious that it was a bogus tape, but and it says a lot that they took that tape and presented it to the American public as something genuine.
Yeah, well, I've spoken recently to journalists who are convinced that tape is legit.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, I mean, here's something that struck me overall, and in as our conversation progresses, I just want you to keep this in mind. In a sense, it seems like the family members and a lot of people, like everybody involved in this, treated the commission members, even though they were engaging in all kinds of, really investigative malfeasance. That's what I would call it. They keep treating them respectfully. They keep sort of giving them the benefit of the doubt. And I have to tell you something, as somebody who has done a lot of, not a lot, because these investigations into high-level malfeasance take a lot of time and effort. But one thing I know is that people at that level who are covering up, and the perpetrators who are at the higher levels even, that's what they depend on. They depend on being treated with some kind of reverence because they have that power.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's part of the dynamic. I can just imagine. I mean, Kristen Breitweiser, who gave a brilliant testimony to the joint Senate and Congress 9/11 inquiry that really broke open the pressure in the Capitol for an investigation in 2002 September, is at the time that her husband dies in the South Tower, a mother with a 2-year-old, a suburban housewife in New Jersey. And so to move from that place of being a stay-at-home mom to suddenly finding yourself in Washington, D.C., testifying before lawmakers, trying to figure out who these people are, it's really tough. And I think also, though, you've got
but talk about what she said.
Yeah,
talk about what Kristen said, because that was interesting.
Well, she said that the explanation the government has said, that we know what's happened, but what lay behind her husband's attacks is not so explainable. Why did people get into planes with illegal weapons, box cutters, and mace? Why did planes fly all over the skies without any military response?
Interception. When before that, every plane that veered off course was accompanied or intercepted in minutes.
Yes,
But
yeah,
all of a sudden, in this case, no.
yes. From 1958 until September 10th, it was true that the U.S. Air Force was, quote, as their motto says, guarding the nation's skies. But on the 11th of September, they were 0 for 4. Even though there are pilots who were interviewed and sent off, it seems, way off the east coast of Connecticut and New York, Long Island, just in the wrong place, and saying, if only we'd known where the planes were, we would have intercepted them, because they train for this 5 to 6 times a month to always intercept planes. Uh, so
Go
yeah,
ahead.
so you've got people trying to figure out. I can just imagine they're wanting to not. There was a lot of wording about they don't want to be partisan. They don't want to come across as a group of 12 in the Family Steering Committee of being partisan, and yet they do issue a report card in September of 2003 after much frustration that the 9/11 Commission now is 9 months into its life and has hardly gotten anything done, only one subpoena, hardly anyone swearing under oath, lots of problems about the minders and so on. So they criticize, the 9/11 Commission gets a very poor grade on almost all manners, secrecy and such. And they also try to get, they issue a press release asking that Philip Zelikow be asked to resign as executive director.
Because of conflict of interest.
Because of conflict of interest. And then, of course, Lee Hamilton and Tom Keene, ever keeping the sunny side up, say, oh no, there's nothing wrong here. Let's keep Zelikow. They also, at the point where Max Cleland of Georgia gives up out of a frustration with the whole way the whole thing's going, because he was one of the commissioners pushing for a real inquiry into whether or not the attacks of September 11th happened, in part because the president had wished to go to war against Iraq, as Paul O'Neill, former Treasury Secretary's memoirs show, that Bush said, find me a way to get into war in Iraq in January of 2001.
First of all, you can go back as far as the Project for a New American Century. They're rebuilding America's defenses. Everybody involved, everybody in a key position in the Bush administration, a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people in key positions in the Bush administration were signatories to this. And, they were talking about, short of a Pearl Harbor type situation where, shock and awe, whatever, we will not be able to implement our plan very quickly. And then right after 9/11, Rumsfeld says, oh yeah, he wrote a little note to himself about, oh, we were worried about a Pearl Harbor situation. Bush talks about Pearl Harbor. It's almost like they're jumping off the PNAC pages, right into now reality. And boy, I gotta tell you, that smells.
It smells a lot. And Beverly Eckert, whose husband Sean Rooney died in the South Tower, said that she was very concerned when she learned about the PNAC and having, John Bolton, Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Zelikow, all of 8 or 9 people who were key involved now in the Bush cabinet, all signatories to thinking that it would be somehow, quote, a good idea for some sort of a new Pearl Harbor to happen. And so the families did ask for, they wanted people who were signing the PNAC to come before the 9/11 Commission and explain themselves in relation to that point exactly. But of course, the 9/11 Commission ignored that. And as they also ignored at the point that Max Cleland resigned, the Family Steering Committee put forward a number of people's names, which actually would have been the responsibility of Tom Daschle to name the replacement as Democrat at that point. And so Kristen Breitweiser on the Family Steering Committee was one of the people that they nominated foremost to replace Max Cleland. But the replacement was actually Bob Kerrey, who I've thought of as a good guy in part because years later he said on a radio show in New York that he thought that there should be a permanent 9/11 commission to look at the things that are have not been, the stones that have not been looked under. However, at the time that he was named, he was a member of the committee for the
Invasion of Iraq,
of
basically,
invasion
but it
of
wasn't.
Iraq. Yeah,
Yes,
that the exact name escapes me, but
yeah.
committee
But
for
that's what
the
the
regime
committee was
change.
about. Yeah,
Yeah,
regime change in Iraq. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And meanwhile, Zelikow is putting on his witness list people like Lori Milroy, who again a propagandist for let's go to Iraq. I mean, they steered a lot of their expert witnesses were about talking about Iraq, and they couldn't even get a connection between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. But at some point, I think Zelikow made a statement where he tried to do that, and the commission say, well, Saddam Hussein was, these terrorists did try and get in touch with Saddam Hussein at some point, but he had her on and a couple of other people on, but no Saudis. No Saudis, which is that's the old look here, not there cover-up technique.
Yes, and also significantly in late March of 2003, it's just 10 or 11 days after the Iraq War has begun. And so interesting that the people coming forth on the first, second days of the public hearings are people who are what Lori Van Auken, whose husband Kenneth died in the North Tower, said. She said to Zelikow that he was involved in a sales pitch for the Iraq War. And so there's this, there are people testifying. I think Lori Milroy saying that Saddam was responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing. But thankfully, he didn't say that Saddam Hussein was responsible for the death of Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, right. So let's talk about how much of a control freak Zelikow was. Not only did he fire his assistant for, getting those documents, but he would not allow anybody to respond to the family members' phone calls. He had to be, he controlled who and how those calls were returned, correct?
Yes, he was that certainly went on for quite a while. It may have been challenged at some point, but certainly that was what he put in place for quite a while. He also ordered his administrative secretary, Karen Heithotter, who'd had a previous background in working for diplomats, American diplomats in Europe. He didn't want her to keep a log of the phone calls he was receiving or making, including to Karl Rove.
Well, that's why she. Did she? I think she talked about that or something, and then all of a sudden she was. But she did continue doing it, didn't she?
She did do that in secret. He didn't know it, but I think another person who was involved on the staff said, "Just go ahead and do it. I think it's important." The general counsel, Dan, I forget his last name, but.
So another thing he did, Zelikow, was control what material the commission members were allowed to review before they interviewed witnesses, right?
Yes, and yeah. So you've got the PDF, the August 6th PDF. President Bush receives a warning about Bin Laden about to strike, and other things that maybe just Zelikow and then Jamie Gorelick in the Clinton administration who's allowed to look at things, but nobody else, none of the other 9/11 commissioners are allowed to see any of the documents. They can't take any minutes about what they're seeing. They just have to. I'm not even sure how much they could even say about what they've seen. And so it's all the secrecies, which makes it very they hobble the capacity for them to really investigate.
Well, it's not an investigation. If you're controlling everything if you're controlling all the witnesses, if you're controlling even the background information, background research that you get on the witnesses, if you're controlling if you're not allowing them to look at secret documents, okay, because that was another thing. Oh, you can't look at the secret documents, okay? So basically, their view, and they, of course, I'm sure they all knew this. They all knew that I mean, Ben Veniste asked some good questions every once in a while, but I think they all knew that they were in some kind of huge containment exercise. I mean, the constraints were beyond ridiculous. I mean, you can't call it an investigation anymore with those constraints, I don't think.
No, and you have the spectacle of public statements to the press by 9/11 commissioners that are deferential and respectful to the Family Steering Committee. Once they receive their many hundreds of questions to be posed to the president, vice president, agencies, and so on, they're told, the press is told that by some of the 9/11 commissioners that these questions that the Family Steering Committee has given us will be a roadmap for how we will do our inquiry. But yet they only answer 9% of the questions with any seriousness, dabble in a few others, which would include a question Secretary Rumsfeld was asked, was Secretary Rumsfeld, did you scramble aircraft to defend the Pentagon? And he looks around at the clock and the wall and the color of the wall, perhaps, and his coffee, and then he simply repeats the question: Did I scramble fighter jets to defend the Pentagon? And then Tom Keene bangs the gavel and says, "Time's up." So that question that he answered by simply repeating the question and not saying anything about it could be counted as a question that was addressed.
Are you kidding? No.
Well,
I mean, and Tom Keene, that Tom Keene stepped in and stopped the clock so that he wouldn't answer that question, to me is quite shocking.
Yeah.
Too.
So it's just all of this continual obstruction of getting to the truth. Lori Van Auken and others comment on how the 9/11 commissioners often will have somebody coming before them for perhaps an hour. There's 10 of them. They have 5 minutes each. It might be extended.
That's ridiculous. Yeah.
So they're doing things like, if I'm having my interview with you, let's pretend that I'm a 9/11 commissioner and you're a witness, and I will not ask you something about your long history and say writing, how did you decide to write Into the Buzzsaw? I'll just say instead, that's a really great bookshelf you have behind you, Christina.
Yes. They ate up the time with banter. Yes, that's another tactic. I've seen it before on major like the POW hearings. The hearings into the POWs who were left behind after Vietnam. You saw a lot of that during that too. Yeah. So the other thing that I thought was very interesting was how the report. This was shocking to me, that the report is based mostly on the testimony of tortured detainees.
Yes.
And everybody knows that torture is not a good way to get the truth out of anybody. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, Harper's Magazine, I think Benjamin DeMott, and also, interestingly, MSNBC back in 2007 or 8, had scathing comments about the what a fraud the 9/11 Commission report was, in their words, because of so much of the key story in chapters 5, 6, and 7 of the report, which tells the story of the hijackers, depends on confessions of detainees who were tortured in Guantanamo and other places. And so, I mean, any one of us might confess to having been a hijacker ourselves if we had enough fingernails ripped off of our fingers or toenails off of our toes. It's crazy to think that this is a way to get nothing that would ever stand up in court.
Well, it's not crazy if you're running a cover-up and you need information that fits into an outline that you've already written before the hearings are even over. Because what you're looking for, and since the CIA is obviously on your side, trying not to, the CIA, my God, I mean, first of all, they gave these terrorists the visas. I mean, they strong armed these
The embassies.
these embassies to give these terrorists visas. They did, they kept the FBI from getting information about the terrorists being in the United States, and now their torture testimony is basically the bulk of what's used for this. Which makes sense because it would go along with the narrative that Zelikow was trying to sell. Failure of imagination narrative. Okay. So I find that very interesting.
Yeah, that's the testimony that they want to help put the whole thing together, the framework for the 9/11 Commission. But what they don't want to include is whistleblower testimony. The families had many people coming to them saying, we need you to get us subpoenaed, because if we're subpoenaed, we have protection. Because if we just waltz in there on our own steam, we could have some retribution back in our department. But if we're subpoenaed, then we have to testify and say what we know. And so one of the people that did come forward was Sibel Edmonds, who they dragged into before the 9/11 commissioners, and she did testify behind closed doors before like 2 or 3 hours. And she told them apparently that the government knew regarding the attacks, that they knew what the method of the attacks would be, namely planes. They knew the date, September 11th, and they knew the targets, the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. Now, maybe somebody else in an open trial would come forward and argue that that was not the case somehow. But that kind of compelling testimony should certainly be part of what the 9/11 report shows, since they interviewed her, but they never included her testimony at all.
Yeah, I mean, I actually made a list of these people, and I wonder if they have a list of all the witnesses that they wanted to see interviewed, because I'd love to see that list. I'd love to interview those people. You said they didn't want to hear from Mark Burton, senior analyst for NSA. FBI counterintelligence agent John Cole, he had information connecting Afghanistan, Pakistan, and 9/11. At Pakistan and 9/11, but commission didn't want. They had Sibel. They had Mike German, who was working a case on terrorist cell in Florida, who discovered FBI senior management had falsified records, failed to properly handle evidence, falsely discredited witnesses, and failed to adhere to laws and regulations about electronic surveillance. Colleen Rowley, of course, who was trying to get into Moussawi's computer, and she was smacked down by her superiors. Baru Sarshar, FBI language specialist, and Sibel Edmonds, by the way, was an FBI translator. And then Robert Wright, who was investigating terrorist financing, who was stifled by his superiors. These are the types of people that they didn't want to hear from.
No, they didn't want to hear from them. And as a family member, I mean, you've got, every day you've got, one less person at the meal table every day to remind you that you want to get to the bottom of this. And they're also being swamped with all of the headlines that everybody who sits down at the end of the day to watch TV or read their magazine or listen to their radio or read their favorite newspaper absorbs all these different headlines, and there's all kinds of different narratives going in so many different directions. And investigator Paul Thompson, who thankfully compiled initially the 9/11 timeline, which the families discovered and then were able to look at to help them amplify the questions that they wanted to ask the 9/11 Commission to address. He says that so often what happens is you have a lead story on the front page, but that story might not be as important as the story that's on page B12 or D7. And often people don't necessarily even get past the front page unless they want to go to the comics. So,
well, I mean, one thing was clear, and first of all, the press just went along. That was all official source reporting. Whatever the official source said, that's what we were going to report. Which is not journalism, by the way,
Yeah.
because generally you have to make sure what the official source has said is true or not. If it's not true, you have to report that. But none of that was done. But which is why I did Into the Buzzsaw, by the way.
Yeah.
But anyway, but one of the things, this is what I thought was brilliant in this book too, was how you created these straight lines. There are certain issues that are huge issues, huge questions. And really, you showed what went on in such a way that a straight line was drawn to all the culprits. It was very interesting. For example, I found it very interesting, your section about all those games, those simulations, the war games.
The war games, yeah.
That were going on during 9/11, okay? And what you come away realizing is that earlier in the year, Dick Cheney had been given the authority to decide and authorize all war games.
Yes.
Earlier in the year. Oh, I saw that. I couldn't believe, I didn't know that. Okay. And so now talk about the war games and why it's so important that so many of them were going on at the same time. And, the pictures of bin Laden, talk about that whole thing.
Okay. So like most of us, my eyes start to glaze over when I even look at 3 or 4 different names of these, alpha, whatever this, and I mean, like, these are not fertile rice. I mean, these are not names that, like, I don't know these names the way I know cinnamon and rosemary and parsley and thyme. And so it's a language that I'm trying to understand. In some cases, there's one name that's slightly different from another name. It's like, and so it's hard for people to put their heads around, and yet there are war games that are happening on the day of, and you have, first of all, you need to have the fighter jets that normally are intercepting planes that fly off course. Many of them are now involved in these war games and not able to be seconded to go after a hijacked plane. They're busy with another job. And so you've got a lot of flight of planes that normally would be in the Northeast sector that are somewhere else far away. As well, you have, with these war games, you have simulated phantom planes, which are now on the radar of the FAA operators. And so with all these simulated phantom planes, you have, in addition to the 4,500 flights that normally would be up in the sky at any given time in the domestic airspace, you have as well all these other phantom planes. And so the radar operators aren't sure what's a real plane and what isn't, as well as the military fighter pilots themselves. And then you have the wonderful coincidence of a number of different war games. Fertile Rice was one of them. And
okay, you have Vigilant Guardian.
Yes.
And before what's interesting is you write that there were an unprecedented number of war games on 9/11. And some of these war games were run before, the year before, but at different times. Before, for example, Vigilant Guardian used to be run, it was a hijack exercise, used to be run in October.
Yes.
Okay. And now it happens on September 11. And then you had 2 field training exercises, Amalgam Warrior and Amalgam Virgo. Okay. Amalgam Warrior typically held in April and October. So this time it's September.
It's another coincidence.
And Global Guardian, and Apollo Guardian also run on the morning of September 11. And the weird thing about all this is the paperwork or for these exercises all had pictures of bin Laden on them, as if they kind of already knew, like this is part of, okay, this is going to happen, and bin Laden is the man.
Yes, and so there's on the one hand you have government official statements by Condoleezza Rice when she goes before the 9/11 Commission saying that nobody could ever have imagined planes hitting buildings, and yet you have several of these war games, Fertile Rice, another one that have on the cover of the manual for these war games set to happen on September 11th or earlier, just happen to have bin Laden's face and the Twin Towers and other things and planes on the front cover of the manual. So, it's hard to believe that that's just a coincidence or someone's being psychic.
No, it's not a coincidence. And not only did Condoleezza Rice lie when she said that, I mean, she also knew about the PDF. I think it was Ben Venice who confronted her and said, hey, the PDF, Presidential Daily Brief,
yes,
PDB, that said bin Laden is going to strike, and specifically mentioned World Trade Center in New York, planes going into world, specifically mentioned that scenario.
Yeah.
So she clearly was lying. So I just found it so interesting that Cheney was the one who walked. So to me, if I'm an investigator, my reptilian brain is saying, oh, I get it. What you do is you have all these exercises going on at the time that this thing is going to happen, so that everybody's confused and they can't respond because they have all these extra things on their radar. They don't know what's real or what's sim. And the General Eberhard, yes, of NORAD, who was asked, please take out these simulations so that we could see what's going on, didn't do it until 10 o'clock.
No,
go ahead, talk about him.
He was busy doing other things. Like that morning, the North Towers hit, the South Towers hit. He's in the NORAD command in, I think, Wyoming, is it? Or Colorado? Cheyenne. Yeah, Cheyenne. And so the towers are hit. And then after that happens, at about just around 9:30 or so, he decides it's a good time to go for a drive in the park.
Yeah.
For 45 minutes. So he says that things have, quote, quieted down. There's nothing quiet about what's going on the TV screens. People are gasping. People are jumping out of buildings, and there's nothing quiet about that at all. But he says, "Oh, I think now I can just carry on. It's a good time for a coffee break."
Well, because he'd done his job.
Yeah.
He'd done his job. He'd let the simulate. He made sure those simulations were all there. That there was all this confusion, so they couldn't respond in a timely fashion. They didn't know what was real and what wasn't real, and people don't even realize this. They don't realize this. Okay, so. And he not only does he do that, but apparently at the Pentagon the day before, he set the alert levels, that defends that there's a system, Infocon, that defends the Pentagon by letting the Pentagon Communications Network know if there are any incoming hostile planes. He set that alert level prior to 9 p.m. on September 10th at its lowest level.
Yeah.
So he deliberately hampered the Pentagon's ability to see an incoming hostile. Yeah.
So this is where I sometimes people talk about, any kind of book that offers any dissent or questioning of the official narrative. And the official narrative is seen as simply the trustworthy narrative, and any narrative questioning it is called a conspiracy theory. And yet, I think of those who ascribe to the official account as coincidence theorists, because there are so many coincidences that just pile up. I mean, Mindy Kleinberg in her testimony before the 9/11 Commission, itemizing so many of these things with the hijackers and everything, says, one cannot call this luck.
Well, look, if you're a real investigator, there are two things I really don't care about. You can say you can say whatever. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the evidence. I'm going to see what the witnesses have to say. I want to see where those two things come together. Okay. If the evidence is there, it's there. And there's certain conclusions. I mean, how can you not draw the conclusion that all of a sudden the vice president who wants to get to Iraq, and really on 9/11, and Rumsfeld writing his memo, figure out, let's grab as much information as we can. Let's try and gather all information, whatever, especially so we can get to Iraq, or, I'm paraphrasing. But anyway, they're talking about going to Iraq. Okay. So the president, the vice president is in charge of authorizing these
War games.
An unprecedented number he authorizes for 9/11. People can't respond because they're all confused and this and that. And then next thing you know, this guy, Eberhard, doesn't want to stand down, doesn't want to turn off the Sims until it's all done, and he disappears. Rumsfeld disappears Rumsfeld claims he wasn't told about anything, except, the day before, he comes forward and says, oh, by the way, there's was it 3.2 trillion or 2.3 trillion missing from the Pentagon's budget. We can't account for it. And lo and behold, on 9/11, what part of the Pentagon gets hit?
All the auditors.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All the auditors are killed. It's
it was not so much from that story. It would seem it wasn't so much the way of life of Americans, but their auditing practices that most upset the terrorists.
For
I mean,
sure.
why if they really are able, as some contend, to pilot the plane the way it was done, with loop-de-loops all over the place, and go into the Pentagon somewhere and do some damage, surely they would have figured out where would be a more destructive place to aim that plane than the auditing department, which is investigating 2 billion plus trillion plus.
Trillion.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now let's turn to the FAA. Let's talk about Mr. Michael Canavan, hijack coordinator. Okay. So
that was the day he had to go off to Puerto Rico.
Yeah. And who was left in his place?
I don't know.
Nobody knows. Nobody knows. So I mean, this whole thing, okay. So let's talk about the money. Following the money. Let's talk about those put options and what you and the scenario. Again, things are pointing to Bush, among other people, and the CIA. So
yeah, you've got people who are involved in, I think, Marsh McClellan, and they are in the bullseye of one of the planes, I think the North Tower, and they've got they're doing a lot of the trading that's involved in the options. People are betting on the airline stocks to fall dramatically, and these bets are happening up to 3 weeks, over a 3-week period prior to September 11th. One of the people who's involved is the number 3 person in the CIA, Buzzy Conrad.
Krongard, Buzzy Krongard.
Yeah. And then there's also the president's cousin, Wirt Walker III, who the FBI decides doesn't need to even be interviewed. Even though he's connected to the Carlyle Group, and there are Bin Laden members on the Carlyle Group board.
Yeah, I
So
mean, Buzzy Krongard, first of all, was CIA, and he was appointed, wasn't he? He was appointed by Bush to be deputy. What was he? What did Bush appoint him to be? I'm trying to remember now. But he has a long and he was part of the bank. He
yeah,
was
Bankers Trust.
he was on the board of Bankers Trust, which was owned by Deutsche Bank, that took care of these options, that managed these options, right? Bankers Trust managed these options, these put options. And very interesting, the company, what's it called again?
Convar?
No,
No.
McClellan and
Marsh McClellan.
Marsh McClellan, who is their risk management guy?
Oh, good old Paul Bremer.
Paul Bremer,
Yeah.
who ends up becoming the czar of Iraq, of the Iraq
Iraq War, he's guiding
occupation.
the whole occupation.
He's in charge of the Iraq. Paul Bremer. I tell you, the way you connected these dots was like absolutely fascinating. Yes, and Wirt Walker, who is connected to Marvin Bush.
Yeah, and the security company involved in the World Trade Center and Dulles and some other places that got hit that day.
Yes, and so what happened? Explain it. What happened with how that information was pulled out of the rubble, so to speak, by that German company.
Yeah, so there's a German company, I think Convar, and they had just developed some very brand new technology. I mean, it's a fluke almost, because if they hadn't developed it, they would never have been able to save any of the information. But as it happened, they did have this new technology, and so they're able to save the information and put together this case. And they said that it's not possible for there not to have been any foreknowledge based on what they were able to say about these unusual stock trades, that there would be people that must have known ahead of time that these attacks were going to happen.
Were they called in?
No.
Well, let me ask you, was Larry Silverstein called in by the commission? Now talk about Larry Silverstein. He's very interesting.
Yes. Larry Silverstein, I'm not remembering whether there was a question about him by the families during the questions, the 9/11 Commission, but I know that in 2007, when Lori Van Auken and Patty Casaza spoke at a gathering of people in New York City about a new investigation for the new 9/11 Commission, a new investigation, they listed among their 10 questions that they want to get addressed was to have Larry Silverstein brought before a new investigative body and say, why is it just you just happen to decide to purchase most of the buildings in the World Trade Center? I think he already had number 7 before that, but he had 1, 2, and 4, and 5 at least, and he got them even though it was a white elephant. You've got billions and billions of dollars that need to be spent on removing asbestos from all the World Trade Center buildings, which would not be making an appealing purchase. And then he also just luckily decides to get terrorist insurance. And after the attacks,
just weeks before, not like a long time before.
Yeah, he had the foresight to get terrorist insurance, so he gets 4.5 billion after the attacks in insurance. And then after that, he wants to also go after the airlines separately for more insurance money.
Well, and on top of that, during 9/11, there's footage of him. Everybody's seen this famous footage of him of him saying to pull Building 7.
Yes. So he says there was such a terrible loss of life in the Twin Towers, so they decided to pull, which means demolish in slang for the demolition industry, to make the building come down by controlled demolition. And I do show in the chapter 19, that there's a lot of usage of that term pull in relationship to lots of news articles by Mark Loiseau and others in Controlled Demolition and other similar companies. And so the families did want to know why would that terminology be used. And so they wanted to have an investigation that the 9/11 Commission completely left unexamined, the matter of a 47-story steel skyscraper falling to the ground in 6.5 or 7 seconds.
Well, in order for that to happen, you have to set explosives in there. For it to happen, especially if it falls in its own footprint, there have to be explosives. So the question is, what does Silverstein know about the placing of explosives in that building? And for that matter, what does Giuliani know, since his emergency team is in that building?
Yeah, on the
before
23rd
9/11.
on the 23rd floor. It's and he's Giuliani.
Giuliani is like the cleanup guy, it seems like the World Trade Center crime scene cleanup guy. That's the way I see him. Sorry.
I mean, families have a range of perspectives on this, from choosing to accept the official account or being highly skeptical and wanting a new investigation, believing government complicity. But at a basic level, when you find out that Giuliani said to ABC on the day of the attacks that he was told 15 minutes before by his own people in the Office of Emergency Management that these buildings were going to collapse catastrophically, where was he and where was his immediate senior staff in terms of getting on the phone, calling the Port Authority that was making all these announcements in the building, saying to people who were running down the staircases, "Go, this is America. You are safe. Go back up to your office desks. If you don't stay in your office desk, you'll be fired." And the people that decided to ignore those announcements on the public address system in the buildings. If the public address system, which was still working, could have said, "You need to get out right away. We think the building's going to collapse." Not everybody, but some more people would have gotten out. Firefighters, occupants.
Go ahead.
So there's that. I mean, just at that level, that's just is awful. And then also it's evil. And then you also have CIA Director George Tenet is having a lovely breakfast over at the St. Regis Hotel restaurant. And about 8:50 a.m., 4 minutes after the North Tower is struck, he's on a phone call. And soon into that phone call, maybe within a minute or two or 5, he is voicing the opinion that the attack, the plane hitting the North Tower, represents a terrorist attack by Osama bin Laden. Well, if he thinks so, in the view of the families, why, Mr. CIA Director, did you not then task someone in the CIA agency to phone the Port Authority and tell them to get everybody to evacuate the building? I mean, just on a basic level.
Well, because he knew what time it was. I'm quite certain, given all the things that he did that are in your book, he definitely knew what time it was. And of course, he got a nice big shiny medal from George Bush after 9/11 was all said and done, So, okay, so Giuliani, who's very interesting to me because, first of all, his Office of Emergency Management, that was kind of a new office. It was set up fairly recently. Was it in 1999? It was set
1999. Yeah, it was like this marquee example of a bunker that was going to be, I mean, it was up on the 23rd floor, but even still, it was like bomb blast proof and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. So in 1999 it's set up, and now he's in charge of all things terrorism related, or if there's a terrorist attack, he's the guy in charge now, and he did not allow the FBI or FEMA to go to the pit where the rubble was to investigate.
No, he wanted instead to have all of all that debris taken away as fast as possible and shipped off to China, South Korea, and other places so that nobody could really look at very much of the evidence.
So now, if you're a real investigator and you really want to know what's going on, and somebody does that, you call that spoliation of evidence.
Yeah.
Which means you have taken evidence from a crime scene and you have destroyed it, hidden it, whatever. And that is a criminal offense.
It is. And Fire Engineering Magazine editor Bill Manning wrote in his editorial in January of 2002 that the investigation that was going on was a farce, and that all of this taking away of the scrap metal and the steel beams must stop immediately. And
well, and before I want to get back to that, I just want to say, because I love to name names when I'm doing these shows, I think it's important. George Tabik of the Port Authority of World Trade Center in New York City, he was the one who gave the order to tell people in South Tower that there was no need to evacuate, go back to your offices. And he said that he got that order from Giuliani's office, from the Office of Emergency Management. Okay, so now let's talk about, and this, I find it very interesting that a lot of the family members, or some of the family members, do not want to look at, and you do in your book, the explosives evidence for 9/11, for the explosives evidence that was left behind at the World Trade Center. Could you talk about that evidence and all the people who either experienced the explosions or saw the molten steel?
Sure. So with the family's questions, I know that Patty Casaza has said that in the documentary 9/11 Press for Truth, which I'd invite people to watch, which is all about the Jersey Girls, especially.
Excellent documentary.
Yeah. And she says in that documentary that she got a phone call from her husband John, and in addition to saying goodbye, I love you, he also said he believed that there were bombs going off in the building. And there may have been others in the family steering committee that also heard about things like that. But a question they wanted the 9/11 Commission to investigate was look into, quote, reports of explosions at the World Trade Center. It was a neutral kind of question because they're not saying who might be responsible. They say, like, we're hearing about this, please look into it.
You had witnesses and first responders talking about it, experiencing it. I mean, Willie Rodriguez being among the most famous of them, right?
Yes, you've got all these people are asking, giving testimony throughout the fall and winter. 503 first responders, firefighters, and EMTs with the Fire Department of New York are telling their superior officers what they did during the rescue efforts. In many cases, you have FBI present at those interviews. And I understand that the 9/11 Commission knew about it. I don't know who all, maybe not all the commissioners knew, but certainly some key people did, but they chose not to really they have very few first responders testifying before the 9/11 Commission. So after the 9/11 Commission report comes out, some family members, and I'm not sure exactly who, but some family members and the New York Times sues the city of New York to release the testimonies.
Yeah, because they suppressed that, they wouldn't allow the public to see that testimony, and you have to ask yourself why.
Yeah. So you got 12,000 pages of testimony, and it's a rather daunting thing. I think maybe as in tribute to the people who died, we can all take on the task of going to the August 12th, 2005 online archive of the New York Times and read one first responder's testimony at a time of the 503 days in a row it would take you to get through 16 months of reading their testimony. And of those, you'll find about 118 who mention specifically bombs, explosions, secondary devices, molten this or that going on. And so it's very compelling. If you have one or two people saying this, maybe you could blow it off. But we have over 100 first responders, and they're going to tell you exactly the truth after a most traumatic day when 343 of their colleagues have died. They're going to tell the truth.
Yeah, and they want to know what happened.
They want to know what happened.
So not one word in the 9/11 Commission report on any of this testimony about bombs, on any, I mean, there are pictures where you can see the molten steel. And people need to understand that the reason why the molten steel is a big issue is because diesel doesn't burn anywhere near, diesel could not melt steel. Fires can't melt steel by any, I mean, it's so low, the strength of the, the heat.
Of the heat.
But the, it's 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit to melt steel. So it's got to be some kind of ordinance. And the other thing that people reported that I thought was interesting that I didn't know until I read your book was they kept talking about how underground it was so hot. It was much hotter underground, as if a lot of the heat generating whatever explosives, it was like there's a heat signature that was still there.
Yeah, and which went on for months. I mean, when Bill Manning
wrote months.
It went on. I think when Bill Manning wrote his editorial in Fire Engineering, he mentions that there's still in January of 2002 there were still hot, molten, and people were finding molten, metal flowing, December even into January of 2002, and I think that this whole story about these explosions was just a glaring example. You've got 43 reporters or news anchors reporting about this, most of them live, some of them sitting at their news desks, many local New York affiliate CBS, ABC, NBC, and so on, reporting. And you've got these reporters interviewing first responders or other people leaving the building or themselves saying that there are explosions. And they're quite clear. These are separate events from a plane hitting a building. These are happening
before.
Yeah, before.
And actually after, because people were saying that they saw like rivers coming out of the side of the building after a while too, right?
Yeah, David Long, who was about to go into a meeting in I think the North Tower, happened to be late because he went to a coffee shop and grabbed a muffin or something, and thankfully he did, because he could see that it was not a building he'd want to enter anymore. But he saw the strangest thing with for 10 seconds or so, what seems to be like flowing molten metal way up high coming out of a building. He said, "What's wrong with this building?" And what's wrong with the building is that you've got Oreo Palmer, who's one of the firefighters, who's tremendously strong, taking all of his gear, 60 pounds of gear, way up, going from the 40th floor with the elevator, climbing up to the 78th, 79th floor. And he's able to say that it's safe for his other colleagues to come. Firefighters can follow up behind him. He's not saying it's unsafe. Go back. It's not safe. He's saying it's safe. We need a couple of hoses to put out some isolated pockets of fire. You also have people like Kevin Cosgrove, who was on the phone in the South Tower, I think, from 9:44 for about 15 minutes, and he's talking on, from what I can gather, a landline. He's able to hold the receiver in his hand. It's not too hot. The cord from the phone to the wall and the jack are not too hot. And yet we're told that molten steel is melting. So it just doesn't add up that you can have a phone receiver that's not too hot to hold, and yet steel that requires 28 degrees Fahrenheit to melt is melting. It just doesn't add up.
Before we get back to the hard evidence that we're discussing right now, I just saw something in my notes that I think is so important to put on the record that you reported, which is, remember I was telling you that Cheney, that you had reported that Cheney had been given the authority to decide what what the exercises, simulated exercises, hijacking exercises were going to happen when that authority was given to him through a presidential executive order that was signed May 8th, 2001.
Yeah. So a long time before.
Not so long, May, June, July, August, just 4 months.
4 months.
Before, Okay, so let's see. And it's so interesting to me. First of all, did the commission ever talk about any of these exercises and the problems with them?
They weren't interested. They didn't get around to it. They didn't talk about it. No.
Okay. So
and you've got people in the Jamie Gorelick they're asking questions of the NORAD generals, and you have people who have lost family members, firefighters, saying, talk about the war games. Just get one of us to go up there and ask some tough questions. And then they're told you're being rude. This is one of a number of times when people are being told they're rude. If you keep asking, how all these outbursts, you'll be removed from the chambers.
Basically, it's rude to run a real investigation. I mean, that's the message behind all that, because what's interesting to me is what your book makes clear is that any hard evidence that was available for discussion, like the molten steel, like the sim versus what's real, the radar information, none of that was discussed. Nothing that was really hard evidence was discussed. And then if you contrast that with what the bulk of the report was based on, which is torture testimony, you realize how shocking the whole 9/11 Commission really is.
It's outrageous, and and yet you have Philip Shannon, reporter for the New York Times, who did from what I can tell, quite a few stories about the 9/11 Commission itself and about the whole 9/11 Commission story in the 2000s, and wrote a very interesting book called Uncensored, so the real history of the 9/11 investigation. And he did interview some of the family steering committee members and members of the 9/11 Commission, and he got quite a bit of some of this, like Karl Rove phone calls and other things like that are part of his book. But when it comes to the question of explosions, bombs going off at the World Trade Center, he just simply says it's outrageous to suggest that. And yet it's so ironic, because here is one of the lead New York Times reporters following the 9/11 file throughout the 2000s, the same paper that releases in August of 2005 the testimony of 503 first responders, of which over 100 reveal that they think that there were bombs going off in the buildings. And so it's just one of these ironies about, maybe that's a soft word, but
I run into that with FBI people. I'll give you an example. Mark Rossini, who was one of the FBI liaison guys at Alex Station, the CIA group that was supposed to be tracking bin Laden. Okay. You want to talk about that? You want to talk about Tom Wilshire and Michael, what was her name? Michael Ann Casey.
Yes.
Talk about that, because Rossini was there when that happened. And so go ahead, and then I'll tell you something about Rossini after that.
So this is the whole thing about getting the visas to.
This is before 9/11.
Yeah.
And the FBI, I forget the name of the FBI guy at Alex Station, wanted to send a memo to FBI headquarters talking about how there were some hijackers who had visas, and I think there was one or two who were already in the United States. He wanted to alert the FBI headquarters to that.
Yeah.
And Tom Wilshire, who was number one, and Michael Ann Casey, who was his lieutenant there, put the kibosh on it. And
Yeah.
Michael Ann Casey then wrote a memo saying that the FBI had been alerted to this. So clearly there was a cover-up going on and a suppression of this very important evidence. And Mark Rossini was there and he knew about it. But what was interesting was that none of the FBI people at Alex Station said, the hell with this. I'm sending that information one way or another.
No, they decided
Yeah.
to back down, and they didn't. They're concerned about all this fast tracking of visas with questions like what year were you born? 1878.
Yeah.
Where will you be staying? No answer. What all kinds of information left on. None of us in the who've ever filled out an application for a temporary visa, if you've traveled to another country that requires it, would ever be able to get to that country if you left anything, even your signature.
Exactly. No, they were obviously running an operation to get these people in. I mean, I don't think there's much question of that when you hear what Springman has to say. He was at the consulate in Jeddah. That was very early on, giving he called it the Visas for Terrorists program. But Colleen Rowley was trying to get access to Moussaoi's computer in Minnesota, and the kibosh was put on her efforts high up in the FBI. So I asked, clearly, and we talked earlier about FBI making up stuff in Florida and so on. And I asked Rossini, I interviewed Rossini, and I said to him, what's going on here? You see that there are all kinds of shenanigans. What do you make of it? And he just looked at me and he goes, well, the House always wins. Oh. And I said, well, that's the big question, isn't it? Who's the House? Who's the House? And I thought to myself, that's the problem. That's the problem. Nobody at the FBI, nobody at the NSA, nobody at the FAA, nobody at NORAD, nobody at all these institutions paid for by our tax dollars.
No, well, Mindy Kleinberg said to a reporter one time, I think in 2004, when they were trying to get at least the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission passed by Congress. And even though these are practical, common sense things you'd want to do if you follow the logic of at least having these recommendations passed, and Congress was resisting it all the way. And so she said, we've been told by the 9/11 Commission that the reason that the attacks happened was because, quote, nobody was in charge.
Do you believe that?
No.
I want to ask you something. Especially since I'll tell you another thing that, we didn't mention, but it's interesting. Another thing that Cheney did was when these ladies were pushing for an independent commission, he was calling up Congress people and threatening them, saying, you will not do this. You will not promote this. So that's in your book too, right?
Yes.
So what I want to ask you in the end is, I'm trying to figure out what picture comes into focus in your head after doing this book?
What picture comes into my head is that because of the way that this narrative the dominant narrative has been running for now 2 decades, where people are told that if they don't, if they question the official narrative that they are conspiracy theorists, that this dominant narrative has made people less able to psychologically question things that are really important. It should not be good enough when a president says that that his alleged perpetrator, bin Laden, has done it, for him to simply say, "We don't need any evidence. We know he's guilty." That should not be good enough.
That should be a red flag.
That should be a red flag. It should be a red flag.
But what I'm really asking you is, to me, the details in this are breathtaking, and it's that thing where what you have done is you have, they talk about in art negative space. All those questions are the unanswered, all those unanswered questions of the 9/11 family, to me, are the negative space. And what you did was you defined that negative space with all your research. And it kind of answered those questions, I feel, to a great extent. And what I'm asking you is, what is it that you have defined around that negative space? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think about the Family Steering Committee and how they've been careful. Even the Jersey girls, Monica Lewinsky, they've never accused.
Lewinsky?
Sorry. Monica Gabrielle. No, Monica Lewinsky was not involved in this at all. Monica Gabrielle and Patty Casaza, Mindy Kleinberg, Kristen Breitweiser, Beverly Eckert, Sally Reagan-Hart, who especially have asked some tougher questions about different things. Mary Fetchett, certainly about the Port Authority and the buildings. But
Kristen.
they've never come out and said, we have a list of people in the government that we think need to be charged with treason or something. And I've had to listen to that restraint, as I'll call it. It might be, we don't want to accuse anyone. We just want there to be a new investigation. We don't want to say anything in case an investigation was sort of dismissed because we're being too hard hitting about what we think an investigation would show if it was done properly. But I think that what I'm left with is that Patty Casaza says that she thinks that the hijackers were patsies. And I think that the idea of a surprise attack is far-fetched and dubious and really not credible. And so what the world is left with, and the American people are left with to chew on, is, by degrees, what was this an attack that happened where people let it happen, foreknowledge? To what degree was this an attack where people orchestrated it? And I think that is more where my evidence shows. I don't go into the to and fro of thinking, insofar as complicity, is it more the CIA or the FBI or the FAA or the Department of Defense or the vice president? Or I think that one could guess and one could be wrong. If there really was a true investigation, you could have certain people come forward as witnesses and shine a light on some things I don't know about. I feel like I'm learning new things all the time, even having researched this book. I watched your interview with Daniel Hopsicker, and a lot of his information was brand new to me. Like, there's so much information for a person to absorb and discover. But I think that it ends up taking people to a very painful and damaging place.
Look, if you don't look at a problem straight in the eye, you'll never fix it. And we'll keep going in this horrific direction that we're going in. That is my firm belief, And I thought it was very interesting. What you just said brought this to mind, that FBI agent Gonzalez, who recently said, I think that the terrorists had a network of supporters in the United States. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting. I wonder who he means.
Yeah. Well, I think that history shows that there have been times in the past in different nations where people wanted things to happen, wanted to go to war. And so there needs to be a real switching up of an understanding that this does happen and has happened even in Gulf of Tonkin and other incidences in the past. And I
Yes,
think
well,
that,
I mean, look, I'm telling you, if you as an investigator aren't suspicious of, we need a new Pearl Harbor, and then, the same people who need a new Pearl Harbor, who, all of a sudden they're in positions of power and this thing happens. If you're not at least suspicious, and that's the thing, I think people have to break through that horrible traumatic thought that, oh my God, people in my own government are, but when you look at cui bono, who benefited?
yeah, I think that what you're talking about, the psychological barrier or threshold to think that it would be possible for one's own government to be involved in orchestrating an attack on their own or with other governments somehow that would result in the deaths of nearly 3,000 people is too horrible. Is too horrible for many people to think about. And I've talked to people that have said that if that really was true, they would be depressed for the rest of their lives and they could never recover, or they become an alcoholic. They've said things like that to me because there was one woman who I think I did feature in my book who talks about a conversation with her brother who brings some information to her, and she finally reads it and then just falls apart.
Well, this is what I have to say, and this may sound mean, and this comes from the movie with Cher. I forget what the name of it is. Moonstruck.
Oh yeah, Moonstruck. Yeah.
Where
get over it.
Snap out of it.
Snap out of it. Yes. Yeah.
Snap out of it. Listen, our way of life is look what's happened, because so much, our civil liberties, trillions of dollars in wars and so have happened because you don't want to wake up and smell the coffee and demand accountability. Come on, stop it. Stop, everybody. This is something that you should, that should get your blood boiling and make you want to go out there and do something. Don't shrivel up. Yeah. Why shrivel up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Fight the good fight.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I think that there are people who are starting to read my book, and I mean, I'm surprised, but I think over and over again, I shouldn't be surprised about anything because people have their lives. One person told me, who just started reading my book this week, and they couldn't put it down. So somebody with a PhD, but they discovered in reading my book that the war in Afghanistan has something to do with 9/11.
Oh,
so
okay.
So I that's not my primary intent of writing my book. That's hopeful. But there are dots that a lot of people are not connecting because all they've seen is a quick headline in the newspaper or a quick talk by some talking heads on some news network, and they make whatever meaning they can, but they haven't connected the dots. They haven't had to because they weren't on the family steering committee and had someone that had died that made them want to look through thousands of newspaper articles to try and put questions before the 9/11 commission to get to the bottom of it. And I think that if there was, hopefully, and this is what I asked for in my book at the end, to say, I think that there really needs to be a new investigation. There are families, a minority of them, that are still asking for that, and that there needs to be a coming clean for truth and reconciliation or something for the nation to move forward. I think that as long as there is a story about September 11th, which is, in my view, a false narrative, that's going to hobble this country going forward for a long time.
Oh, it already has. Yeah. Look what, I mean, it's cost us so much in blood and treasure. It's unbelievable. But my question to you then is, who is going to be the honest broker in charge of such an investigation? Who?
I don't know. I don't know. And I only suggest that a new investigation simply because there are families that are still asking for one. But maybe there needs to be an international body, but I don't know, because I'm aware that there are, with the world's mightiest superpower, that there are a lot of phone calls that can be made to different embassies and around the world, saying we don't want, Spain or whoever might want to have spearhead an investigation into September 11th, or Japan. A few phone calls and a little bit of economic pressure can quickly put the kibosh on that. So I don't know that maybe it's just left to miracle to see if who would investigate. Maybe a citizens group of some sort, perhaps with you heading it up.
With that, I'll just say this about what you've done here. You have truly honored the memory of those people, those victims, and the family members who are trying to get justice and accountability. You've done a brilliant job.
Thank you very much.
So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I think that my hope is that they know, the ones especially asking questions, and the ones that are even satisfied with the answers they've been given, that they do know that there are people, not just in America, but people around the world. We're all living in a post 9/11 world. In Canada, we lost 159 soldiers in Afghanistan, and we had all those planes arriving in Newfoundland, 38 planes, and it's affecting people all around the world, and still does, and especially in the Middle East. And so I think that they need to know, especially the ones asking the tough questions, that those tough questions are going to hopefully still be asked by people generations from now. History is judging us.